Okay, we'll start with this. This past weekend, unbeaten up-and-comer in the super bantamweight division, Ellie Scotney. Got out there for the 6th time in her professional career, and she didn't fail to impress. Post-fight, I heard some mention of a world title shot, a world title opportunity. And some of those world titles, they're easier to win than others. It's Ellie Scotney's good fortune that she campaigns in a densely populated division that offers a lot more variety than what you might find at weights like junior middle, and super middle. There are ample fights and ample champions to go around, ample world title opportunities. At super bantamweight, there are 4 world champions. Shernika Johnson, holding the IBF. Yamilet Mercado, who was also in action this past weekend. She's got the WBC. Unbeaten Sigaline Lafarve of La France. She's got the WBO, and Mayerling Rivas of Venezuela. She's got the WBA. If it's Matchroom's intention and Ellie Scotney's team's intention to pursue an alphabet title in the near future, as soon as Ellie's next fight, they need to tread carefully. They need to tread lightly.
They do.
Because while I think Ellie Scotney has one of the highest ceilings, if not the highest ceiling, of any unbeaten up-and-comer at or around these weights, some of those belts really would be harder to win than others, even for Ellie, who only has 6 professional fights, and she's very young. I mean, she really does have one of the highest ceilings of any unbeaten up-and-comer at or around these weights, but at only 6-0, do you really want to put her in there with a champion just yet? You don't want to give her a little bit more time so that you're sure. I heard some mention post-fight of them targeting Shernika Johnson, New Zealand-born, Australian-based IBF champion who was in action not that long ago on the undercard of Haney versus Kambosos 2. Shernika Johnson, otherwise known as Sugar Neeks. You know, based on Ellie Scotney's ceiling, her talents as a fighter, how far she can really go, and I think she can go far, and who she's fought so far in just 6 professional fights, I'd sooner put her in there against Yamilet Mercado, a mid-range to inside pressure fighter, the same way that Mary Romero's a pressure fighter, and Jorgelina Guanini. Melis Gangloff to some degree as well. Do you see what I'm getting at? I would sooner put Ellie Scotney in there with Yami Mercado for the green belt than put her in there with Shernika Johnson for the blue one, because Shernika's a lot trickier than Yami Mercado. It's just a very different fight with a very different kind of fighter that I haven't seen Ellie in there with. Shernika, like the other 3 champions at this weight, they have a lot more professional experience than young Ellie, they do, but Shernika's also battle-tested. She's been in there with Shotgun Shannon O'Connell. More recently, she was in there with Suzy Q Ramadan, and she bossed it. Had to battle through some adversity, a bad cut on her forehead, blood everywhere. It was like a horror movie. But in spite of that, she bossed it. She won that fight wide, and Shernika Johnson, she's not a mid-range to inside pressure fighter. No, she's not that crude. She's a streamlined fighter, a nuanced finesse fighting kind of fighter, the same way that Ellie Scotney is a nuanced finesse fighting kind of fighter, with the difference being that Shernika is a lot more experienced than Ellie, at least in the pro ranks. So it's not as easy to win that belt from Shernika as it might be to win a belt from, say, Yami Mercado, who's right up Ellie Scotney's alley. Yami's a pressure fighter, the same as Mary Romero, Melis Gangloff, Jorgelina Guanini. She's that kind of fighter. She has the kind of defensive deficiencies that Ellie Scotney can exploit. I would say that compared to those fighters, Yamilet Mercado is a cut above them as far as pressure fighters go, and we know she's durable. She went the distance with Amanda Serrano, for God's sake. Blow for blow, I think she's a bigger puncher than those other fighters as well, but hand on heart, I think Ellie Scotney's ready for a Yamilet Mercado fight. I do. Hand on heart, I think she can beat her. Whereas with Shernika Johnson, you know how Ellie's good at managing the distance, staying on her toes, and fighting on the balls of her feet? Yeah, Shernika Johnson can do that also, but she's more experienced as a professional than Ellie, with more rounds in the bank. You know how Ellie's athletic? So is Shernika. You know how Ellie can punch a bit? So can Shernika. You know how Ellie's got good hand speed and foot speed? Shernika's got those same qualities. So, I mean, it depends on what you want to do. If you want to make it harder for Ellie to win win a world title, then you stay the course and you take on Shanika.
That doesn't even mean that Ellie can't win. It's more along the lines of perhaps Ellie should get more rounds in the bank and amass more professional experience
before taking on somebody like that, because that's a finesse fighting kind of fighter with subtleties and nuances, whereas with Jamie Mercado, you've seen fighters like Jamie Mercado. You're ready for that.
Just 6 professional contests, 6 professional bouts, which is pretty fucking impressive, by the way.
I'd say the 2 more difficult champions that are out there for Ellie to take on would have to be Shanika, who I just talked about, reigning WBA champion of Venezuela, Mayerlin Rivas. She's a very heavy-handed puncher with game-changing power. I'd say those 2 fights would be the more difficult fights for Ellie to win a world title, whereas Yamileth Mercado, that seems a highly winnable fight to me for Ellie Scotney, and Sigaline Lafarve to some degree. Sigaline, who's got a lot more pro fights than Ellie does, but Ellie's quality of competition is actually somewhat better than Sigaline's.
Yeah, that's not saying that Sigaline's a bad fighter. She's not a bad fighter. She's got some stuff to her as well.
At this level, all the fighters do. The championship level. All these different fighters got their strengths and their weaknesses, and some fights are easier to win than others. But for my money, the most winnable world title for Ellie Scotney at 122 pounds would have to be the green belt. It would have to be the WBC title, more so than the blue belt. And I feel they should shift their focus to a Mercado fight instead of a Johnson fight. Just one man's opinion. Feel free to disagree. In men's lightweight news, in reference to this past weekend's contest, Vasyl Lomachenko's long-awaited ring return, the knee-jerk reactions are out. Content creator Two-Tone the Superstar, he said Devin Haney versus Lomachenko is going to look like Floyd Mayweather versus Arturo Gatti. Rest in peace. I can't say I agree with that based on a Jermaine Ortiz fight. I think that's a hot take. I think that's a pretty hot take.
For more reasons than one. For starters, Devin Haney's not the puncher now that Mayweather was then, particularly in that fight. Devin's not a puncher.
I mean, if you remember the Floyd Mayweather of old, Pretty Boy Floyd, the one that fought Arturo Gatti, that guy was a killer. That guy had knockout power, not just boxing acumen.
Whereas Devin hasn't proven to have knockout power. He's not a puncher. I mean, he's a great young boxer, that he is. But he's not now what Pretty Boy Floyd was then, no.
Rolo N.A. for the dough said, nah, bruh, Haney washes Loma. Length, match, footwork, to take away the angles. Plus, Haney's got a 12-round motor, jab, and respectable power. Loma's cooked. He knows it. He even implied it last night. Need more prep post-interview comments.
The reason I categorize these reactions as knee-jerk reactions is because you're basing this on how he looked against Jermaine Ortiz.
But what were the circumstances going into the Ortiz fight? I told you what they were. This guy, he hadn't fought in 10, going on 11 months. He was shaking off ring rust in that fight. That's the first thing. The second thing,
I don't know how Devin Haney's making that weight. A lot of people have been speculating that he's struggling and that soon it may be time to move up, that perhaps it might have been time to move up at least 1 or 2 fights ago, whereas Jermaine, I know of no issues Jermaine is having with making lightweight.
And Jermaine Ortiz is not the carbon copy or the spitting image of Devin Haney stylistically. I'd wager that Jermaine actually packs a more respectable punch and is stronger in the clinch than young Devin.
Jermaine Ortiz is a switch hitter. He can fight orthodox, he can fight southpaw. Devin don't do that. Not saying that he can or can't, but he hasn't shown it yet.
I mean, it's safe to say that Devin Haney isn't known as a switch hitter, a guy who does that often.
And that Jermaine Ortiz kid, for my money, he's better mid-range to inside than Devin. Oh, yeah.
Devin Haney's got a lot of strengths as a fighter. He does. But mid-range to inside fighting, that ain't one of them. In fact, mid-range to inside, I'd wager he's vulnerable. More vulnerable than Jermaine Ortiz. Lest we forget, mid-range to inside, that's where Jorge Linares got off that big right hand that had Devin hurt for more than just 1 round. To the eye, Jermaine Ortiz throws more punches mid-range to inside than Devin.
Don't misunderstand me. I'm just highlighting how the parallel, it doesn't apply. However Vasyl Lomachenko looks against a Jermaine Ortiz doesn't necessarily speak to how he'll look against a Devin Haney. And we all know that in a Devin Haney fight, the circumstances would be entirely different.
With Jermaine, he was coming off a 10 going on 11 months of inactivity, whereas with Devin, he'll be sharp.
Sharper than he was yesterday, because that's what yesterday's fight was for. That kind of wake-up call. I've seen it before.
Do you remember when Tyson Fury took on Otto Wallin? And going into the fight, everybody thought that Otto Wallin was going to be a cakewalk for Tyson Fury, the same as Tom Schwartz. And Tyson Fury actually had to go through the gears to beat that guy. Last night, Vasyl Lomachenko had to go through the gears to beat Jermaine Ortiz. Now, who did Tyson Fury fight right after that Otto Wallin fight? He fought Deontay Wilder, and he beat Deontay Wilder from pillar to post. I believe that Otto Wallin fight, it was a wake-up call for him. Tighten up.
Coincidentally, I believe that yesterday's fight was a wake-up call for Vasyl Lomachenko.
And if nothing else, in the fight, the early goings of it, this was a guy who was shaking off ring rust. A lot of people don't want to acknowledge that. They want to write it off as excuses from avid Lomachenko fans.
And hey, you ain't got to factor that into the equation. You can do that just as easily as I can write off your comments and say, well...
Of course you'd say that. Of course you'd write Vasyl Lomachenko off based on the Ortiz fight because you already don't like the fucking guy.
It's a two-way street and the pendulum swings both ways. For my money, I told you, this Ortiz fight ain't going to be easy, but it is going to be what Vasyl Lomachenko needs because he needs to be sharp against Devin.
Devin Haney needs to be sharp against him because Devin Haney hasn't come up against anybody like this. This is not George Kambosos.
And before you tell me how he's about to Arturo Gatti this guy, he didn't Arturo Gatti Jorge Linares, who's a great fighter, he is, but he's chinny. He's always been chinny.
Before you tell me that Devin Haney's about to Arturo Gatti Vasyl Lomachenko, explain to me why he didn't Arturo Gatti Jorge Linares. Explain to me why he couldn't stop that guy, but Zaur Abdullayev could. Zaur Abdullayev, who's a common opponent between them. I'm sorry to say that Devin's a great young fighter. He is. But he's not a puncher.
No, he's not a puncher. That's why Gamboa went the distance with him and Jorge Linares. In a fight with Vasyl Lomachenko, I still think Vasyl Lomachenko would be the bigger puncher.
It's not even about writing off Devin's chances, more along the lines of highlighting the inaccuracies with certain parallels that are being drawn based on yesterday's fight. Jermaine Ortiz ain't Devin Haney, and Devin Haney ain't Jermaine Ortiz. And how Vasyl Lomachenko looks against one of those guys may not be how he looks against the other.
Loma's critics, for whatever reason, don't want to accept that he was shaking off ring rust in yesterday's fight. And unless there's 10 months between his last fight and his next fight, he won't have to shake off ring rust with Devin.
It's a completely different fight. Different fight, different night, different circumstances.
That's all I'm saying.
One thing that Vasyl Lomachenko said leading into this fight with Jermaine Ortiz that caught my attention, a sentiment I've shared many times here on the channel, is that a Stevenson fight is actually more difficult than a Haney fight. Those of you that have been following this channel long enough will have heard me say that many times before.
Vasyl Lomachenko was quoted as saying, I think the more difficult fight is Shakur Stevenson. I think he's more technical.
Haney, of course, gleefully stepped in for Lomachenko earlier this year, making consecutive trips to Melbourne, Australia to take on George Kambosos Jr. The end result was a historic one, as Haney would become the youngest fighter in the four-belt era to become an undisputed champion. Stevenson, on the other hand, after failing to make the 130-pound weight limit for his most recent trip to the ring against Robson Conceição, brazenly stated that moving forward, he'll compete in the lightweight division.
That's another aspect of this you want to factor into the equation. A part of the reason I actually like Shakur's chances against Lomachenko is he'll be moving up in weight.
With Devin, there's a question as to whether or not he's overstayed his welcome at lightweight, or is he set to overstay his welcome if he fights Vasyl Lomachenko, and that's a part of the reason that he doesn't seem to take the greatest punch. You know, when Jorge Linares connected with that right hand, it took Devin Haney a long time to recover from it. You could see it in his legs. With Shakur Stevenson, well, he's just now arriving at lightweight, and he might arrive there more invigorated, more energized, galvanized, as a result of not having to cut down to 130, not having to cut that extra 5 pounds.
I saw a lot of people picking Devin Haney to beat Vasyl Lomachenko based on the Ortiz fight yesterday, Rick Glacier being one among them.
There's nothing wrong with that. If you don't like the guy's chances, you don't like the guy's chances. Pick your poison. Pick your horse in the race based on what you know or what you think you know. It's what we're all doing.
Because ultimately, until both boys are in the ring and until there's an outcome, none of us really know what's going to happen. We can only guess. Take our best guess at how that fight plays out.
For me and my money, that's an important factor. That where Devin Haney may be essentially overstaying his welcome at lightweight because he's very young and his body is still growing, he may be depleting himself making that weight. And ahead of a Vasyl Lomachenko fight, his punch resistance, it could suffer for it.
I still think Vasyl Lomachenko hits harder at lightweight than Devin. Devin's not a puncher, I'm sorry. But, Jorge Linares was able to go the distance with Devin. He wasn't able to go the distance with Vasyl Lomachenko.
Yuriorkis Gamboa. He was able to go the distance with Devin, but he wasn't able to go the distance with Gervonta Davis or Isaac Cruz.
It's not a knock on Devin. I'm just addressing the parallel that Devin's gonna Arturo Gatti. Lomachenko, yeah, I don't think so. Devin's not a puncher.
He's a great young fighter who has a lot of things working for him in a Lomachenko fight, but power isn't one of them, or mid-range to inside fighting. Those are not strong areas.
Devin's not a mid-range to inside guy. He's an outside fighter. For God's sake, his money punch is his jab. When he can get full extension on it, mid-range to inside, he's more likely to clinch.
More likely to tie the guy up than exchange and trade punches. Trading punches is what got him hurt with Jorge Linares. And against Vasyl Lomachenko, that's something you have to look out for. You try to open up on this guy and let the fists fly, he might hit you with something hard.
For me and my money, this is a box office fight. This is pay-per-view worthy. There is genuine intrigue there because while Devin may be lacking in some areas, he's not lacking in others. I think he has the hand speed and foot speed to make things interesting, particular to foot speed. I think he can turn with Lomachenko.
You know how Lomachenko's got those fancy shifts, those fancy pivots to where he gets to the side of the guy, catches him with a shot from a blind spot? Well, I think Devin's got enough foot speed that he can turn with Vasyl Lomachenko to stop that from happening, or at minimum, make it difficult for Loma to get off those kinds of shots, get off those kinds of punches. The question is, can he do this down the stretch?
A part of the reason that Jermaine Ortiz lost yesterday was because he faded down the stretch. The pace at which the fight was being fought caught up to him. He's not used to having to work at that rate.
And it's not a foregone conclusion that Devin can do it either.
Well, he probably can look sharp early, the same way that Jermaine Ortiz did early, while he was still fresh, but down the stretch.
How do we know that Devin doesn't start to fade the same way that Jermaine Ortiz started to fade? Because that's what costed Jermaine Ortiz the fight. In the beginning, he looked all right.
Can he really keep up that pace at a weight he may have outgrown against a guy who's got a pretty high work rate? Volume puncher. I mean, don't forget, Vasyl Lomachenko ain't struggling to make lightweight, but Devin Haney, he might be.
Devin Haney's not a prolific puncher. He's not a combination guy. It's 1 and 2 pot shots at a time from the outside, safely behind the jab.
So, a lot of people, they're rushing to assumption, jumping to conclusions based on the Ortiz fight.
But for me and my money, Devin Haney versus Vasyl Lomachenko is still a very close fight where both guys got different things working for them.
And if they bill it as a box office fight, if they make it a pay-per-view, that's a pay-per-view I'm buying.